One of the very common problems that can have a big impact on home or school life is when we can't get certain children to follow our instructions. Wouldn't it be nice if we could spend more time teaching or interacting with our children and less time trying to get them to listen to us? But behaviour that on the surface may look like non-compliance or disrespect can have alternative explanations. So stay with me as in this video we look at 3 common reasons why some children don't respond to us and what we can do about it. Hi, I'm Lydia, psychology assistant and mother of young children with autism. Welcome to Neurodiversity in the 3 Primary Colours, a space where you can understand more about diversity in the minds of children and adults and find some must-have psychology hacks to help your family, school or organisation run more smoothly today. The very first thing you want to ask yourself when a child isn't responding to your instructions is, are you actually getting the child's attention? You may think you are, but are you really getting the child's attention? This is an important question because many children are different in the way that they regulate their attention. When giving an instruction to these children, you need to be thinking about 2 things. Firstly, a cue, something that can initially grab their attention. And secondly, and really importantly, time to either shift their attention from what they are currently thinking about or doing to what it is you want to say to them, or time to process that someone is speaking to them and requires a response from them. So one of the very effective strategies for gaining the attention of children is therefore to simply say their name and wait for the child to acknowledge in some way that they are listening before bringing in your instruction. For some children, you may be able to say their name and then give the instruction. So long as you then wait, you bring in that second time factor afterwards. Sounds super simple, but in practice, in the classroom or in family life, this introduction of cues and especially time into how we communicate is incredibly counterintuitive, and we catch ourselves too quickly repeating the child's name or repeating the instruction without pausing. Parents, this can be especially hard when we feel that social pressure to hurry the child along, but persevere despite of onlookers, because many report that waiting sometimes even 20 or 30 seconds is a super effective strategy for getting your child to respond in those times when it really looks like that they are not listening to you. The next thing you want to think about is whether the child is processing your instructions. These are children who may seem like they are in their own little world, or they may be children who seem to require a lot of extra prompting generally from adults in everyday tasks compared to other children. We mentioned time as an important factor in processing, but sometimes time is just not of the essence. When a child has difficulties processing, there are 2 approaches we can use. The first is to use strategies that bypass the need for the child to process verbal information at all. One way to do that is to give instructions visually. This is because, unlike verbal information, visual information does not seem to require these children to shift their attention out of what they're doing in the same way in order to process it. However, these classic visual prompts that are often recommended can be very hard to access on the go, and what can be much more practical is simply a repetitive visual sign or action you can do with your hand instead or as well as giving the instruction verbally. Another way to bypass the need for these kids to process verbal information is to make verbal information automatic. One way we can do this is to use repetitive words and phrases when giving instructions. If you keep these everyday instruction phrases consistent over time on a subconscious automatic level, the child learns to associate those phrases with certain actions that they have to do, and their behaviour therefore becomes much easier to direct when using those phrases. The second approach to helping children who are having difficulties processing instructions is to think about and target what might be underlying the processing difficulty. For example, some children find it difficult to differentiate or separate multi-step instructions into their separate parts. These will be children who seem to maybe only be able to carry out one instruction at a time, but rather than shortening the instruction, try differentiating it instead. We do this by, rather than saying something like,
Caleb, get your science textbook out and turn to page 73.
Instead saying something like,
Caleb, I want you to number 1, get your science textbook out, and number 2, turn to page 73.
Then some children who find it difficult to internally process or mentally process instructions can easily process them externally or outside of their heads. For these children, you can ask the child to repeat the instruction back to you, helping the child to process what it is you're asking them to do externally or out loud. Or even better, try combining some of these techniques. For example, you might want to try putting your repetitive phrase in a question format that requires a repetitive answer.
What Mummy says, Mummy? Me! Where do we put our homeworks in our storage bags?
Or if you try differentiating instruction, then try getting the child to repeat the steps back to you.
Maya, 1 shoes and 2 car. What's 1? What's 2?
Then finally, the third thing you want to think about for a child who's not responding to your instructions is the context surrounding the instruction you are giving. And the very first thing that's really important to think about here is whether your instruction relates to a transition for that child. This is a hugely important topic that we will look at in more detail in a separate video, but 2 super quick bullet points here to make is that, first of all, for some children, everyday transitions or changes between tasks and activities can seem completely unexpected. These children have difficulty using aspects of context or past situations to predict aspects of their day or predict the likeliness or unlikeliness of things changing. They therefore need to be given a prior warning, a signal or a heads up before the change occurs. And secondly, what doesn't seem to be a transition point for you or for other children could still be a transition point for that child. These children tend to automatically lay down blueprints in their minds about how everyday situations are going to play out. Sometimes that's okay, but other times it can go very wrong, meaning a sudden unexpected transition occurs in the child's mind that we do not see, and we probably don't know anything about it. The other important aspect of the context surrounding your instruction is to think about whether there is a social element to the language of the instruction that you are using. Remember that some children fail to pick up on the social meaning of language or the social context of the instruction, and instead interpret your speech in a much more literal or concrete way. In practice, we don't tend to question how we say things, so if a child is not responding, start asking yourself, are there any patterns here in the type of instruction this child is not responding to? These children will need instructions to be kept deliberately literal, as well as explicit explanations sometimes as to the meaning of certain phrases that we're using. And remember, if there is some underlying difficulty understanding social elements of language, these children may also not be using their own words or their own body language to show you that they are listening. So that's 3 things to think about when a child isn't responding to you. Make sure you catch my future videos for more practical top tips on ways to help children process, respond and stay on task. Thank you for watching and see you next time.